This story takes me back to one of our family gatherings that happened a few years ago at my uncle's mountain cabin in Colorado. The place was as remote as it gets, no cell service, no neighbors for miles, and surrounded by dense forest that seemed to swallow all sound. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, especially at night. On our second night there, we had all gathered around the living room after dinner, sharing stories and just enjoying each other's company. The cabin had a large glass window that overlooked the trees, and as the sun set, the view outside turned into an inky black void, reflecting the room's warm glow like a giant mirror. For a while, the night was peaceful. Then, something strange happened. It started with a knock on the window, just one, loud enough to make everyone stop talking. We all turned, expecting to see someone standing there, maybe a late-arriving relative, but the window was empty. My uncle brushed it off, saying it was probably a tree branch or an animal, though I could tell by his expression that he was a little unsettled. We tried to go back to our conversation, but a few minutes later, it happened again. This time, it was a rapid series of taps, almost like fingers drumming on the glass. The room went silent, everyone staring at the window. The darkness outside felt thicker, like it was pressing against the glass, and the only thing we could see was our own reflection staring back. My cousin Jake, who's always been the bravest among us, decided he'd had enough. He grabbed a flashlight, announcing he'd go outside to check if anything was there. The rest of us were hesitant, but he reassured us it was nothing to worry about, and stepped out the front door. We watched through the window as his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trees as he walked around the side of the cabin. For a minute or two, everything was quiet. Then we saw him stop, his flashlight aimed at something just beyond the tree line. He stood there, completely still, like he was frozen in place. Then out of nowhere, he turned and sprinted back to the cabin, his face pale, slamming the door behind him. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at the floor, catching his breath. Finally, when we asked him what he'd seen, he looked up with wide eyes and simply said, "There's someone out there." My uncle grabbed a flashlight and went out himself, determined to see if Jake was pulling a prank on us. But when he came back, he had a strange look on his face, like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. He wouldn't say anything, just shook his head and muttered that it was probably just an animal. But we all knew he didn't believe that. After that, the atmosphere in the cabin was tense. We tried to settle down, but every little sound seemed louder than before, like the cabin was amplifying every creak and groan. Then the tapping started again, but this time it wasn't just at the window. It sounded like it was coming from all sides of the cabin, like someone or something was surrounding us, tapping from every direction. At that point, everyone was scared. My aunt suggested we all stay in the main room together, turning off all the lights to make it look like no one was home. We sat there in the dark, barely breathing, listening to the relentless tapping that seemed to move around the cabin. It would stop for a few seconds, then pick up again on the opposite wall, like whoever was out there knew we were listening and wanted us to know they weren't going away. After what felt like hours, the tapping finally stopped. We sat there in silence, too scared to move, until dawn started to break. The soft morning light brought a sense of relief, and we slowly started to move around, convincing ourselves that maybe it really had been some kind of animal. But when we went outside, we found something that told us otherwise. All around the cabin, right up against the walls, were footprints. They were small, human-like, but with something strange about them. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like, pressed deep into the dirt, circling the cabin. They led back into the trees, disappearing into the forest's shadows. That was the last time our family stayed at that cabin. My uncle sold it shortly after, and none of us ever wanted to return. To this day, no one in our family talks about that night. But every once in a while I'll catch Jake staring off, a distant look in his eyes, and I know he's remembering those small, clawed footprints and the tapping that surrounded us in the dark, up there in the mountains. This story takes place about 5 years ago, during our annual family reunion at my aunt and uncle's farmhouse in rural Wisconsin. We'd meet there every summer, all of us packed into the old house, surrounded by nothing but open fields and thick woods in every direction. It was a place where you could feel truly alone with nature. But after what happened, that isolation became more of a curse than a blessing. The night started like any other gathering, with everyone sharing stories, playing card games and laughing until our cheeks hurt. As night fell, the house took on that cozy, sleepy vibe, with the younger kids already in bed and the adults winding down. My cousin Sarah and I decided to sneak out onto the back porch to look at the stars. Out there, the sky was so dark that the stars looked like they went on forever, and for a while it was just us and the cool night air. But after a few minutes, Sarah nudged me and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears, but at first, all I heard was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then I caught it, a low, rhythmic sound like a distant hum or chant. We looked at each other, both confused. It was so faint that I almost thought I was imagining it, but Sarah's wide eyes told me she heard it too. We debated going back inside to get one of the adults, but curiosity got the better of us. We decided to follow the sound, stepping carefully off the porch and into the yard. The farmhouse was the only house for miles, and there was no chance any neighbors were out there, which only made the whole thing feel more unsettling. The hum seemed to be coming from beyond the tree line that bordered the property, almost like it was calling us in. As we walked closer, the sound became clearer. It was definitely some kind of chanting, low and repetitive, like a ritual. I couldn't make out any words, but it was hypnotic, pulling us in despite every instinct telling us to turn back. The trees cast long shadows under the faint moonlight, and the path grew darker as we stepped into the woods. I could feel my pulse quickening, a part of me screaming that this was a bad idea. Suddenly we came to a small clearing, and that's when we saw them. 3 figures dressed in what looked like old, worn robes, standing in a tight circle around a small, makeshift fire. They were swaying slightly, their heads bowed, chanting softly in a language I couldn't understand. We froze, too shocked and terrified to move. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows across their faces, but it was their eyes that scared me the most. They were closed, but their expressions were blank, almost as if they were in a trance. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in so hard it hurt, and I could tell she was just as frightened as I was. My mouth went dry as I watched, unable to look away, paralyzed with fear. One of the figures suddenly stopped chanting and opened their eyes. They looked straight at us, as if they'd known we were there all along. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the others were now turning to look as well. In that moment, pure terror took over. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we turned to run back the way we came. I could hear footsteps behind us, soft but unmistakable, as if the figures were gliding rather than running. The chanting started again, louder this time, echoing through the trees in a way that made it impossible to tell how close they were. We ran faster, tripping over roots and stumbling through the dark, our only thought to get back to the safety of the house. Finally, the farmhouse came into view, its warm lights a beacon in the darkness. We burst through the back door, gasping for breath and slamming it shut behind us. Everyone inside looked at us like we'd gone crazy, but we couldn't bring ourselves to explain. We didn't want them to think we'd imagined it, or worse, that we'd seen something real. For the rest of the night, We stayed close to each other, not daring to look out the windows. Every small noise outside made us jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of those blank, trance-like faces staring back at me from the darkness. The next morning, Sarah and I went back to the clearing thinking we'd find some evidence of what we'd seen, a burned patch on the ground, footprints, anything. But when we got there, the clearing looked untouched, as if no one had been there at all. No ashes, no footprints, nothing. It was as if the figures had never existed, but we both knew what we'd seen and we knew we hadn't imagined it. To this day, Sarah and I don't talk about it much, but every time we go back to that farmhouse, there's this silent understanding between us. We avoid the woods at night, and neither of us ever ventures too far from the house. We know that whatever we saw that night, it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for someone else to wander too close. This happened a few years back during our annual family reunion at my grandparents' lake house. The lake was remote, deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees and only accessible by a winding dirt road. We'd spent countless summers there, swimming, fishing, and telling ghost stories by the fire. But that year, something happened that none of us were prepared for, something that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It was the second night of our stay, and my younger cousins had begged us for a night hike. My brother Alex and I volunteered to take them, thinking it would be fun to scare them a little with spooky stories along the way. We gathered flashlights and headed out toward the lake, promising everyone we'd stay close to the house. The path was narrow, barely visible under the canopy of trees that blocked out most of the moonlight. It was so dark that even our flashlights struggled to cut through the shadows, making everything look distorted and eerie. The younger kids clung to us, nervously giggling, and we kept the mood light, pretending we heard strange sounds to make them jump. But then we actually did hear something, and it wasn't part of the joke. It was a faint splash, like something had fallen into the lake, followed by an unsettling silence. We stopped, shining our flashlights toward the water, but there was nothing there, just the gentle ripple of waves lapping against the shore. Alex shrugged it off as a fish or a branch falling in, but I noticed that the kids had gone quiet, clutching each other as if they could feel something was wrong. We decided to continue the hike, though, sticking to the edge of the lake. As we walked, we started noticing odd things along the shore. Small piles of stones arranged in strange patterns, bits of wood tied together to look like tiny figures, almost like dolls. At first, we thought it was just some kind of kids' game or maybe something left by other visitors, but there was something unsettling about the way everything was laid out, like it was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Then, from somewhere in the trees behind us came a voice. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to make every hair on my neck stand up. It was calling my brother's name. Alex. He stopped dead in his tracks, turning to look at me with wide eyes. The voice came again, a little louder this time, still whispering, but unmistakably saying, "Alex." It wasn't any of our relatives. It wasn't a voice we recognized. It sounded wrong, almost as if someone was trying to imitate a human voice but couldn't quite get it right. The kids were terrified, and honestly, so was I. Alex called out, "Who's there?" But there was no response, just silence, deep and unnerving. Then, out of nowhere, a cold breeze blew over us, rustling the leaves in a way that made everything seem alive and watching. One of the kids started crying, and that was enough for us. We turned around and started heading back to the house, walking as fast as we could without actually breaking into a run. As we neared the path leading back to the house, the voice called out again, this time right behind us, closer than it had been before. "Alex!" The sound was raspy, almost like a hiss, and it sent a shiver down my spine. Alex and I exchanged a look of pure terror, realizing that whoever or whatever it was, it had followed us. We broke into a sprint, the kids struggling to keep up, as we bolted toward the lights of the lake house. I could hear the voice fading behind us, still whispering Alex's name, but growing fainter with each step. When we finally burst through the door, everyone looked up, alarmed by the look on our faces and the tears in the kids' eyes. We tried to explain what had happened, but it sounded ridiculous, like a bad horror movie plot. Still, I could tell that our parents were spooked by our reaction. That night, none of us slept. Alex and I stayed up, taking turns looking out the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the yard, watching the house. But nothing happened. The rest of the night was silent, almost unnervingly so, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The next morning, we went down to the lake to see if we could find any sign of what we'd seen. The stone piles and the wooden dolls were still there, arranged neatly along the shore, almost like they were waiting for us. Alex picked one up, a small doll made of sticks tied together with bits of thread, and I saw a strange look cross his face. Tied to the doll was a tiny piece of paper, brittle and yellowed, with something scrawled on it in faded ink. It read, "Come find me." We dropped the doll and left the lake, not saying a word to each other or to anyone else. We spent the rest of the reunion inside, never going back down to the water. That was the last time our family ever went to the lake house. My grandparents sold it a few months later, and we never asked why. But I think Alex and I both knew that whatever was out there by the lake, it hadn't wanted us to leave. It was supposed to be a simple weekend at my aunt and uncle's old farmhouse. Our whole family had gathered there for a reunion, something we tried to do every couple of years. The farmhouse was a bit run down, surrounded by acres of overgrown fields and a nearby forest that seemed to stretch on forever. It had been in the family for generations, and even though it had its quirks, we'd never thought of it as creepy until that night. The first evening was typical, lots of food, laughter, and everyone catching up on each other's lives. But as the night wore on, a strange tension seemed to settle over the house. My cousin Emma and I decided to take a break from the crowded living room and explore the upstairs. Neither of us had been up there in years, and we thought it would be fun to see if the old rooms looked the same as we remembered. As we wandered through the narrow hallway, our flashlights casting long shadows on the faded wallpaper, we started noticing little things that seemed off. The air was stale, thick with a smell like old books and dust. Every creak of the floorboard sounded louder than it should, echoing down the hall in a way that made us both nervous. We reached the end of the hall where an old wooden door stood slightly ajar. I didn't remember there being a door there, and when I looked at Emma, she seemed just as surprised. But curiosity got the better of us, so we pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was empty except for an old rocking chair in the corner, facing the window. The chair looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Its fabric was faded and torn, the wood worn and splintered. But the thing that caught our attention was the faint outline of something etched into the floor in front of it, like scratch marks arranged in strange, looping patterns. It looked almost deliberate, as if someone had been sitting there, scratching into the floorboards over and over. Emma moved her flashlight across the walls, and that's when we noticed something even stranger. Scrawled all over the walls in faded pencil were hundreds of names. They covered every inch of the room, written in small, careful handwriting. Some names were repeated, scratched over and over, while others looked like they'd been added more recently. We were both freaked out, whispering about whether it was some sort of old family thing or a prank. But before we could figure it out, we heard it, a soft, rhythmic creaking coming from behind us. We turned to see the rocking chair moving, slowly rocking back and forth on its own. Emma grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and I could feel her shaking. We both stared at the chair, too scared to even breathe. Then, out of nowhere, a faint whisper filled the room, like someone was muttering just under their breath. We couldn't make out any words, but it sounded angry, insistent, like it was demanding something from us. Without thinking, we bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind us and racing down the hallway back to the living room. We tried to tell our parents what we'd seen, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just our imagination playing tricks on us. That night, Emma and I couldn't sleep. We lay in our sleeping bags in the living room, jumping at every little sound, convinced we'd see that rocking chair again if we dared to look. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of quiet footsteps, soft and slow, moving down the hallway toward us. I held my breath, listening, as the footsteps stopped just outside the living room. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it was one of my aunts or uncles getting up for a glass of water. But then I heard the whispering again, faint but unmistakable, coming from just beyond the doorway. It was the same angry, muttering voice from upstairs, growing louder as if it were right there in the room with us. I nudged Emma, who was wide awake, her eyes wide with fear. She'd heard it too. We lay there, paralyzed, listening, as the voice seemed to drift through the room, circling us, muttering those incomprehensible words. After what felt like forever, the whispering stopped, and the room fell silent. The next morning, we were both exhausted, but we decided we had to check that room one last time before we left. When we went upstairs, we found the door wide open. The rocking chair was still there, facing the window, but something was different. The names on the walls had changed. There, scratched in rough, jagged letters, were our names, mine and Emma's, etched into the wood, alongside the hundreds of others. We ran downstairs, barely able to speak, and insisted on leaving right away. Our parents thought we were being dramatic, but we didn't care. We couldn't get out of that farmhouse fast enough. Since then, neither of us has gone back. We don't talk about that night, but I know Emma remembers it as clearly as I do. Sometimes I wonder about that farmhouse, if it still stands, and if the rocking chair is still there, facing the window, slowly scratching new names into the walls. This happened a few years ago during one of our family gatherings in a small cabin my grandparents owned. Every summer, our whole extended family would get together there, just a few hours from where we all lived. It was the type of place where everyone could unwind, away from the constant hum of city life. Surrounded by dense woods, the cabin was old but comfortable and a sort of cherished tradition for us. The gathering usually lasted for a weekend, with everyone sharing stories, playing games, and catching up. It was peaceful, until the night I'm about to tell you about. That night, I was out on the back porch with my cousin, Liam. We'd snuck out for some fresh air while everyone else was busy inside, mostly eating and talking over each other. I remember it was darker than usual, with only a thin sliver of the moon hanging in the sky, casting long shadows over the yard and trees beyond. It felt like the kind of darkness that somehow made everything sound quieter than usual. Liam and I were talking about random stuff, teasing each other as we always did, when we both suddenly froze. We'd heard it, a faint, crackling sound, like twigs snapping underfoot, coming from the direction of the woods. At first, we shrugged it off as an animal. There were deer around, and it wasn't unusual to hear them moving around at night. But then, it came again, only louder and closer. Liam and I looked at each other, sharing an unspoken feeling of unease. He muttered something about a bear as a joke, but I could tell he was just as nervous as I was. The cabin was far from any major trails and nobody else was expected that night. Our family was all inside and we hadn't seen any other cars parked out front. I whispered to him, "Maybe we should head back in." But before we could, there was another sound, a deep, slow crunch, like someone was walking in heavy boots. This time, it was unmistakably close, just past the edge of the yard. We went silent, our eyes straining to see through the darkness. There, at the edge of the trees, we finally saw it. A figure, tall and unmoving, just standing there. Whoever it was, they were barely visible in the dim light, almost blending in with the tree line. We couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person. "Who's there?" Liam called out, his voice a mix of forced bravado and fear. But the figure didn't move or respond. It just stood there, like it was watching us. At that moment, the door to the cabin opened, and my dad stepped out, probably to see where we were. The figure took a single step back, deeper into the shadows, and then disappeared. It was like it had melted into the trees. My dad didn't see anything, but could tell by the look on our faces that something was wrong. When we tried explaining what we saw, he brushed it off as our imagination, telling us it was probably just shadows playing tricks on us. For the rest of the night, Liam and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time we glanced out the windows, we half expected to see that shadowy figure standing there again, waiting. But the night passed without any more signs of it, and by morning, the feeling had faded a bit. We tried to convince ourselves that it really had just been a trick of the light. The following night, we all gathered for a big family dinner. Everyone was in a good mood, laughing, sharing stories, and passing plates of food around. It felt like that strange encounter had finally lifted from our minds, until the lights flickered. They didn't just go out instantly, but sort of dimmed, almost like someone was slowly turning a dial. The room was filled with that uneasy silence, where everyone stopped talking at once. Then, just as the lights returned to full brightness, the power went out entirely. My uncle tried to make a joke about it, saying it was part of the cabin experience, but even he sounded nervous. Suddenly, we all heard it. The same sound Liam and I had heard the night before. Slow, heavy footsteps, crunching on the gravel outside. This time, everyone froze, looking toward the door. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be circling the cabin, moving slowly, deliberately. The footsteps stopped and started like someone was walking around, listening, or maybe even waiting. I remember the silence was so thick that even a whisper would have sounded loud. My mum, who never seemed scared of anything, was gripping my dad's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. My cousin Liam was sitting across from me, wide-eyed, his face pale. I could tell he was thinking the same thing as me. The figure from the night before had come back. After a few tense minutes, the footsteps stopped, replaced by the distant rustling of leaves. No one dared move or even breathe too loudly, just listening and waiting. Finally, my dad and my uncle grabbed flashlights and went to check outside. They walked around the entire perimeter of the cabin, shining their beams into the trees and across the yard. But there was nothing there, no sign of anyone. The power came back on a little while later, and slowly everyone tried to return to normal, though it was clear no one felt truly relaxed. That night, after everyone had finally settled down and gone to bed, I found myself lying awake, every creak and groan of the old cabin sending my mind racing. I was on edge, my heart pounding, convinced that I'd see that figure again if I looked out the window, but I was too scared to even peek. The next morning, as we were packing up to leave, Liam and I went out one last time to the spot where we'd first seen the figure. We wanted to check, just to see if there was any trace of someone having been there. and to our surprise, we found something. Embedded in the soft ground, right near the edge of the trees, was a single footprint. It was large, much larger than any of our family's shoes, and it was pointed directly toward the cabin. We never talked about it with the family after that day. Liam and I made a silent agreement to keep it between us. The footprint was proof of something or someone that had been watching us that weekend, lurking just beyond the safety of the cabin walls. To this day, I can't go back to that cabin without a chill running down my spine, wondering if next time that figure would come even closer.